first version of emerging categories that came from out of the analysis of the interviews and after having reflected on them in the videologs. This first version will serve as a basis for further discussion in the focus groups and discussion with my tutor. First notion is peripheral knowledge. There's knowledge that builds upon the three conceptions of knowledge by Cochrane, Smith and Little. Knowledge for practice, formal knowledge generated by researchers outside the school, knowledge in practice, teachers' own practical knowledge generated through their own systematic inquiry, and knowledge of practice, intentional investigation generated by teachers critically examining their own classrooms. It is clear from the interviews that the knowledge teachers pick up through Twitter is not always intentional and is not necessarily linked to their own practice. Therefore, the notion knowledge about practice. Secondly, Twitter is non-linear. That is a notion that extends on the continuing professional development as a decifit model as stated by Jackson. This decifit model says that there is a problem A and that needs to be resolved, or a situation A that needs to be resolved grows into a situation B, a problem needs to be resolved, and there is an interplay between A and B. The nature of Twitter, on the other hand, is rather unpredictable. It is not always problem-centered. It is not always usable at the moment, and it is harder to control. That might conflict with the tendency of teachers to control perhaps the situation and their view on CPD, as where there is a situation A or a problem, and that has to be a solution has to be found. There is also an incubation period needed for continuing professional development through Twitter, and the notion of time or the lack of time will rise. So instead of a decifit model, CPD as a decifit model, we could say that Twitter is more looking around to all directions and not per se problem-centered. Third notion that rose mainly from after the interview with Els is the mindset of the teachers. It is clear that expectations of the participants is driven by curiosity. To a certain extent, they allow uncertainty. Although they find joy and they find satisfaction when diving into that overload of information, they still, it feels kind of uncertain, and they find a needle in a haystack that can result in feelings of satisfaction and joy. Although the participants do not engage in discussions very often, they still say that it provides them with a kind of relatedness to other practitioners. It really builds on their competences, and it is individually determined. So we can say that Twitter as CPD also is linked to the self-determination theory of Ryan and DC. Fourth notion, I would like to introduce the notion of live-wide inspiration. At first, I investigated the tension between live-wide learning and lifelong learning, whereas lifelong learning refers more to the dimension of time, and live-wide learning is more about the dimension space. But after having read Bista's work on learnification, one can argue and one can doubt that all knowledge picked up by Twitter is actually learning. It does not always find its translation, its transfer to the actual professional context of the classroom. So therefore, it is more inspirational than perhaps really learning. I will dive into that later on. A quote of John Seeley Brown that is really linked to this notion of life-wide inspiration. The way forward is not to look ahead, but to look around. And also, inspiration was one of the main categories that came out of the word clouds of the participants. The concept of blurred boundaries. That has to do with professional self of Kelchtermans and the personal and professional identity of Rohan and others, where the participants deliberately and on purpose mix contents outside education. One can refer to that as the alfalfa effect as well. Not all participants deliberately mix contents, but it is a lot of them do. So this refers to the notion of multiple identities, whereas how they perform and how they act and how they participate on Twitter is outside their school context, is outside their their teaching practicality and teaching practice. Awareness of boundaries and the concept of time. It might be interesting to formulate suggestions on that, of how to become aware of those boundaries, since social media for teachers is blurring the boundary between those two identities. And last notion, CPD is emotional, and that refers to the work of Hargraves. All the participants in the interviews experienced that they are charged by Twitter with positive emotion. They talk about satisfaction and joy, about fulfillment, but they also talk about anxiety, especially in the beginning, for instance, but most of them do really talk about satisfaction and joy. So one can argue that continuing the professional development without looking at it from the angle of emotions is not okay. So finally, an overview from the first emerging categories are peripheral knowledge, the concept that Twitter is non-linear in opposite to the deficit model, the mindset of the teacher is central. It is about life-wide inspiration. Blurred boundaries are important, and CPD is emotional. Thank you and bye. My apologies for my little throat problem.